meeting seminar, and I'm the first speaker, so I don't need anything or to say anything. When I looked at the program that Molly devised, and I looked at the title, 10 years of, on a decade of trying not to define narratives, I thought, oh my God. And why did I think that? 3 years ago, when I reflected on the 10 years of the Center for Narrative Research at the Marxist Memorial Library, where we were holding a whole day, I summarized our work in the center as 10 years of trying not to define narratives. I have to say that although people laughed, they did not really like it. It has to be admitted that people prefer to have some definitions done and dusted before they roll up their sleeves to do narrative work. But listen to the good news. Today I have come up with a definition that I feel very happy with, and here I offer it. Narrative is the art of not telling a story. And this doesn't come from me. It comes again from Susan Lancers in the symposium at Cambridge last week that I already talked about. But what does this mean? Well, in my view, and this is my own interpretation, people, I think, need to have definitions when they don't have rich stories to be working with. In which case, they just submit themselves to story worlds and their unexpected encounters, and they really don't bother about definitions, narratological canons, or narrative terms. I am totally convinced that any attempt to define and therefore tame or discipline stories is failed from the beginning. And it is at this point that narrative comes handy as an abstract concept and therefore in need of definition in order to conceal the fact that you don't really have a story or that the story you have simply doesn't tell. And it gets worse. Even when we have a definition, we very soon realize that narrative, like Guinness, doesn't travel well. It doesn't travel well from discipline to discipline, and when it does, it's radically recreated, re-evaluated, and transposed. Moreover, the problem of different genres, areas, questions, and concepts is not just a matter of discipline, but also a matter of geography. It is in this context that in our introduction to the book, Doing Narrative Research, which, by the way, we only have 15 copies left, but you can order, so I did my marketing as well here, we point out that although narrative research is both popular and engaging, it is also difficult to grasp and manage, and Corinne already talked about it in the beginning. What definitely lies at the heart of this difficulty is that unlike other qualitative research perspectives, narrative research offers no strict frameworks or definitive methodological moves. Indeed, a crucial understanding that emerges from such an approach is that narrative research is a craft, an open process where concepts, questions, and even methods and theories take up form and generate new thoughts, themes, ideas, and questions in the making. And I gave you an example in my talk about the letter and its form and how it generates things rather than constraints. It is with this idea of narrativity as process that I have been mostly preoccupied recently. And when I take up the question of process, I do not mean the Aristotelian well-known process of beginning, middle, end, or its post-ramifications, stories with multiple beginnings, unfinished or broken, fragmented, you name it. What I have in mind here is the underlying activity of the performative here and now of the story, and Anne also talked about it a lot, when its meaning emerges as a naturalized event. This is where narrative as force makes sense. Force that allows stories configured as events to take up meaning, which, as Arendt has pointed out, cannot be defined, let alone prescribed. I'm not saying here, of course, that the form of the story, its literary or oral qualities are not important. Of course they are. And so are the cultural, historical, and political contexts within which stories are made, communicated, or travel. What I'm arguing here is that while we do have rich and substantial bodies of literature dealing with the content, form, and context of stories, we still have given very little attention to the underlying process of how stories take up meaning. And this is where I have suggested that Deleuzian perspectives that actually go through Whitehead's notion of prehension can make a significant contribution. Let me give you an example. When we read a story or listen to a story or watch a story, we do so from a specific perspective, the here and now of the reading, listening, or watching, not the Bakhtinian chronotope of the plot. In this light, the meaning of the story emerges through what Whitehead calls the process of unification, of grasping into unity of different storylines, events, or characters, as well as their interrelations, the underlying activity of prehension, and a definition, a very short definition of prehension for Whitehead is apprehension that may or may not be cognitive. For Whitehead, this gathering of perspectives into unity makes connections with and refers to other spaces, other times, and in the case of narrative prehension, as I call it, other stories. And while here we do have Kristeva's important notion of intertextuality to help us with looking into the prehensive unity, what we lack, I argue, is studying the materiality of the underlying process of prehension, which is what I'm trying to do in my current work with archives and narratives. Thanks.
I know, nothing like getting a bit of your own medicine. Okay, let's see down here. Okay, thank you. Maria, tell me when I have 3 minutes left. Okay, please. Okay, well, as I've told you already, the assignment really was to revisit our chapters and to see how they relate to questions of everyday narratives. And then when I went to do it on my own chapter, I thought, this was actually really clever of me because it fits so absolutely perfectly, okay? Because my chapter, which was called Never the Last Word, is actually about the shifting ground of interpretation. And I start out with this picture, this fabulous picture, I think, of a fault line, which basically the idea being that you might think that you are in a stable present, but in fact, even while you don't realize it, the ground around us is always shifting. And in the chapter, I begin by framing this in terms of Rosaldo's really wonderful, wonderful opening to his book, Culture and Truth, where he talks about trying to understand cannibalism, and he couldn't really understand it until the trauma of losing his own wife led him to such a desperate place that he actually then came to think of desperate actions in a different kind of way. And he says here, all interpretations are provisional They are made by position subjects who are prepared to know certain things and not others. Analyses are always incomplete. And I think that the key point here is that the viewpoint from which we interpret the world is always one which is changing. And as a number of us have commented, not least being Kathy Reisman, there is never one single authorized meaning, not only by one person, but not only between people, but also, your first reading is not necessarily more true or more complete than your second or your third. But one of the things that we tend to do as scholars is second, third, or whatever is the most recent reading we tend to privilege, rather than saying, well, actually these are multiple positions and which should be held together. And here I quote Jens Brockmeyer, who is not only a very good friend of CNR, but also wrote the conclusion to this new edition of the book. And Jens says here, we are never in the moment of gathering data, and we are always in the moment of gathering data. The observing, analyzing, narrating I always remains unstable, provisional, troubled vantage point. Moreover, every secondary analysis can be, and in reality is, the subject of another secondary analysis. And he goes on there. For those of you who know Jens, it won't be surprising to hear that this was actually just in a casual email. Okay? So, yes. But the idea here, I think, is about the fragility of the standpoint from which we actually offer our interpretations. As Kierkegaard says, life must be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards, which I think, Anne, is exactly the point you were making this morning in this intensive workshop. And that, in fact, it's not just that the world changes, that history happens, right? But that, in fact, our lives happen as well, and people enter it and leave it, and we become different in relation to all sorts of things as the world turns as well. And that these two together are the thing which actually offer the complex axis from which we try to make our interpretive analyses. So now, just to bring you up to date, that's sort of more from the chapter as it was. But what's interesting for me as I was trying to think about this piece today was that when I wrote that piece for the 2008, I had no idea where my own work would take me. And in fact, where my own work has taken me in the subsequent time is back to Berlin, back to former East Germany, where I had done a study in 1992, actually with critical activists, critical anti-state activists at that time. And I got some money from the Wissenschaftszentrum of Berlin, and I have spent quite a lot of time re-interviewing, as you see here, 15 of the 40 original interviewees. And what I did, first of all, it was hard enough to sort of track them down, but what I did is I actually sent them the original recordings of our interview 20 years before and the transcript. And that's where we started talking, okay? But of course, their life had happened in the meantime. That not only had my life radically changed, and I did things like had children and moved countries and did all sorts of other things, but so had theirs, and in a very radical way. And so what was really interesting was to get the interpreter, Birgit Schmidt, myself, and the original interview, sometimes in the very same room, 20 years later, revisiting these recordings and these transcripts. And I just to give you a little idea, I just chose two excerpts from these. One is from an actress, Ruth Reinecke. Okay, Ruth Reinecke. When I met her, she was she was also already an actress at the Maxim Gorky Theater, but she has in the meantime become a very, very well-known actress. In fact, she's one of the stars in this program, which is called Weissensee. It's a serial that's watched basically by everyone there. Ruth Reinecke says to me here, after I was in the mood to listen to these old tapes again, I was really surprised how clear my answers have been. I listened to myself as Ruth new and strange at the same time, because so much time has passed. Without listening to the tapes, I would not have remembered my feelings at this time. 3 years after the Wende, so well. I wouldn't know how much anymore without the tapes. It was also a good document for me too. Some things particularly touched me. And it was really interesting having this as an initial starting point, because we talked very candidly and openly for a long time based on revisiting these conversations. Another person was Reinhard Weissung, and I asked him, I say, so if you compare your political priorities, orientation, political activism now to when we last met, what's changed? He says, well, the task is the same, only the situation has changed. So what's your task? To encourage democracy and emancipation. But my situation is different because I'm no longer someone who needs help with that. Instead, I'm the one who can give help to others. And it's interesting for me because although he's a very, very well-known politician in Berlin, because of these initial and very intimate conversations, we in fact had that second interview 20 years later in the very same room, in his living room, where we had it 20 years before. Pretty interesting stuff. So then just to really conclude here again, where we were talking about this morning, Les Back says very eloquently, making the social world hold still for its portrait can seem like gross violence, reducing its mutable flow to frozen moments preserved in the hoarfrost of realist description. In fact, we might think that our data is, quote, stable and that it's sort of there for us to analyze, but life happens. And it's really interesting to try to bring into our interpretation that shifting ground. And so just to conclude then, historical changes, as well as changes in our individual circumstances, provide us with opportunities to see new layers of meaning in our data. This is evidence of the resilience and vitality of narrative data as we explore the world within and around us. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so I'm pleased to introduce Gerrit, who came all the way from Belgium to be with us today. And Gerrit is one of our authors with a new section in the book. So he has worked with a team, but not everybody could be here today. So we are very pleased to be with you, Gerrit.
Okay. Thank you very much for your introduction. I'll just fix this one. So in my 10 minutes of reflecting on narrative and everyday life, I would like to refer to a narrative approach we recently used to study subjectivity of children and adolescents embedded in their social context. Yeah. Before continuing, as has been told, I'm not a native English speaker. So when you start to doubt about what language I'm speaking, I will still be trying to speak English. So this approach starts from an idea of Molly and her colleagues, who stated that narrative research challenges the dualism between individual and society. So starting from that point, we wanted to study the subjectivity out of that dualism. So, it's coming. It's coming. Yeah, probably. If there's going to be for every slide, I need more time than 10 minutes. So they stated, narrative research makes it possible to locate the self as a psychosocial phenomenon, and subjectivity can be seen as discursively constructed, yet still as active and effective. The individual and the social are constructed in relation to each other, not in the outer world of society and culture, nor in the inner world of the personal, but in a distinct psychosocial zone. And that's exactly what we wanted to do, to study subjectivity in that psychosocial zone. And to do this, we focused on the voice. Oh God. So, well, exactly, yeah, I will talk while it's going. More exactly, on the narrator's voice. Not as a metaphor, but as a physical and physiologically embedded entity in which persons are expressing their feelings, their thoughts to an outward audience. So I would like to explain a little bit these physical aspects by a quote of Tom Anderson, who stated, it's coming, every word and expressed emotion are emitted by exhaling a stream of air, which is produced by the muscles in the abdominal wall and lower part of the back, modulated by the larynx and acted on by the muscles of the tongue, the lips, the palate, the jaws, and the nose. The activities of these muscles interfere with the stream of air, transforming it in the formation of consonant, vowels, words, and meaning. On the other hand, tension in the body and those muscles are related to obstructing the free flow of air and inhibiting and influencing the process of generating meaning. In other words, when we start from this point of view, from this narrating physiological voice, the voice is not a representation of an inner world, but a construction of the inner world in the moment of narrating. So it opened up a view which is looking to the narrative as an expression in the first place, but also a performance on the other hand. An expression not as a reflection of the inner world, but as that construction of the experience. That construction of the experience expressed in the voice, which is moreover not only a singular voicing. It's coming. It's not the singular narrative voice, but a polyphony of voices. And now I refer to the work of Carol Gilligan in the Listening Diagram, which he says our inner world, our experiential world, is a multiplicity of experiences which are expressed by the voice, simultaneously by different voices, referring to that multiplicity of constructing the experiential world, and which are connected to each other, which are connected to other voices, and which are connected to the social and the cultural. So that means, and it's going to come, that means that we also look from that voicing to narratives as performances. It's in the performance of the self, which is going to come here, it's in the performance of the self that the inner world is constructed. But it's more than this. A performance makes it possible that we are going to connect the polyphony of experienced voices to the outer world, to the relational world, to the others. And connect subjectivity in the psychosocial zone and study it as continuously and multifariously constructed in response to the social and cultural context. So it becomes very fluid, always in change. And this change we wanted to study, this connectedness we wanted to study by using two things in terms of grammatical positioning within the social context, and second, the different audiences that are directed to. Concerning the first one, we were looking for the voices as, it's going to come, I'll tell us, as the pronoun voices. We were looking, considering all pronoun voices, I voices, we voices, one voices, other versus one voices, passive and active forms. This offered us an opportunity to locate subjectivity into the social or discursive context in the next way. The narrating voice could be approached as negotiating subjectivity in terms of moral positions within the rules of life of local cultures and discourses. So this experiential voicing started to become a positioning in the social cultural environment. And secondly, we were directing ourselves in this performance to the audience. And this is based on what Maria taught. We're not looking to the narrative as a representation, but as an event. And as she wrote, as an event which is responding to life. Responding to life instead of representing life. And this made a very big difference for us. Because we were inhibited to the narrative research by decontextualizing the narratives and looking beyond the text, vertically, towards what are the facts, what are the experiences, what is the core self beneath the stories. So, we're looking to narrative, not as response, or the voices, not as response. Not as representation, but as responses. We stay in the horizontal field. And we are going to connect these responses to, as was said, other narratives, to other audiences, other discourses, and so on. So we start to make a horizontal connectedness. And in this horizontal connectedness, we went one step further. We went to read, we went to study the audiences of the voices. To whom the voices were directed. And narrative are not only responses. Narrative based on Gilles Deleuze's work, wrote Maria, are also opening up new things to happen. Communication to come. The yet to come forces that make changes. So, and it's this double aspect in the work of Gilles Deleuze, which we took to connect horizontally to the subjectivity and to the relational world. An event has no present, but is the object of that double question. What has just happened, or what is going to happen? Narrating is no longer a state of being, but in that way becomes a plane for the emergence of other becomings. It makes new things happen. So, what we did was going through our text, looking for the narrating voices, and interpreting these voices in terms of two questions. To whom or to what is the narrator responding at the moment? And which new meanings, audiences, and possible ways to continue the narrating process are generated at the moment. So we studied the narratives as going on processes, at each moment opening up. So, by doing all this, I would like to end with a question. When we are studying narratives from the narrator's physiologically embedded voice as a continuously expression and performance of subjectivity in context, in that psychosocial context, narratives seem to become everyday life. I'm wondering, is there any difference at that moment? So that's the question I wanted to conclude with. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the chapter that I wrote and slightly revised for the second edition. This was an accidental chapter. We knew when we were editing this book that Wendy was going to write a very nice chapter moving from event narratives towards an experience-centered view of narrative. We knew that Anne was going to write a lovely chapter about positioning a narrative. Somebody had to write something in the middle, and I had to write something in the middle. And this was the chapter that is called From Experience-Centered to Culturally Oriented Narratives. And I had to ventriloquize a lot in that chapter because some of those approaches I actively dislike, actually. I hope that doesn't show really too much. But it's become interesting to me since because I've found ways to manage that dislike, particularly through the work of Joan Scott around experience, where she writes very beautifully about the constructed and performed nature of experience, and also through, I think, what is a blurring in narrative research generally between these perspectives. There used to be a kind of siloing off, a kind of secretion of work around self-narratives away from other things, and that's much less true, I think, than it used to be. And then I also became comforted, in fact, by the etymology of experience in the Latin word experia, which is to try. It's an effortful making of something. So I felt that I could kind of recuperate experience in some ways into the kind of effortful practice of making everyday narratives. And I think that has worked out kind of okay for me. And this happened, in fact, to coincide with me doing, as many narrative researchers have done, moving away from just looking at oral and written narratives towards looking at some visual work. And myself and Chidan Estin and an artist, a very lovely artist called Shaila Berman, did a project in East London on visual autobiographies, in which we asked people to make visual images of themselves, in their lives in East London, or their position in East London, you might say. And they had to do this at life level, like big, big pictures of themselves, with materials they usually didn't use, like collage materials and pens and so on. So it was a very unfamiliar kind of practice. It was, an exceptional everyday, you could say. It's certainly not what they did every day, but it was done in everyday situations, and it was done with friends often. So there was an everydayness about it, but there was a certain exceptionality, which of course does characterize certain days. Or every day, in fact, of the everyday. There's something exceptional about it. So these were interesting perspectives for us to see coming out of people's work, because these were made, these were produced representations of experience, produced pictures of experience. It wasn't something that people had worked on saying. They produced experience in these images. We also looked at the way that people talked about these pictures. They gave us verbal accounts as well of what was going on in the pictures. And we also did a kind of ethnography of the activity narratives around how people came and did the work, what order they did things in, how they did the interviews, what happened when they went to the exhibition, if they did go to the exhibition, how they interacted with people at the exhibition, and so on. So there were several levels of narrative production going on. And that was interesting work for all of us, I think. So first, what became apparent was that people doing this work were producing experience, as experience always is produced in a way, but that was very foregrounded, that was being produced in this slightly exceptional circumstance. Something else that was very obvious was the situating of these autobiographical accounts. These are only readable if you know certain things about the types of images involved. For instance, the young man who did this was about 15. He used this kind of black star image of the eyes because he says, you know how you see it in comics? Where the comics draw stars coming out when somebody's gotten hit. Okay. So, and he has all this tagging around from the neighborhood. He has tags all over the image, which is a very specific visual kind of coding. And specific to areas of Stepney, in fact. There's some images that, can I see the Stepney STP image? Anyway, there are some specific elements from Stepney, which you need to know about in order to read properly. And some of these images also have interesting aspects like flags in them. Oh yeah, STP is up here. Interesting emphases on having flags in the image that relate to usually parents' countries of origin. This was done in an after-school club in East London. So they're very situated images and not immediately readable. And people are very aware of that with visual autobiography work, I think. With verbal work, it often seems much more transparent. One assumes that one knows what the words mean in a way that one doesn't with the images. Something else I think that comes out of this kind of work very strikingly is the is the particularity of individual productions of experience. I think there are elements that are stubbornly particular. For instance, in the order of which this young man made his image, he made the wounds on the body, which are wounds of, kind of future stories of sometimes you can be out in this area and get hurt. And then he kind of covered them up, and you described this afterwards, but he actually did it in the art session. He covered them up with the tags, which are all the images of his friends that are his group around him that protect him. So he made the image and then he kind of covered it with the tags afterwards. And that wasn't something that anybody else did, in fact. And then also when he revisited this image later, he, in describing it, he verbally rejected it. He said, this image, I don't want to be like this all the time. And he kind of painted a more kind of progressive future for himself. But there were also people who, in revisiting their images, found them very more negative than this and actually felt that they had nowhere to go with them. So this kind of production of experience was not always a positive thing. Some people felt quite constrained by it later and found nowhere to go with it. But at the same time, even though these images were very, very variable, I think that there were certain commonalities, what Lincoln and Gubar would call transferable aspects of what we found across these images. Perhaps not very visible in this one, but in many of them, especially in the children's images, actually, there were elements, in fact in this one to some extent, there were elements of transnationalism that were very, very strong. The children's images were and the children themselves were particularly conscious of this. For instance, they knew about where the origins of this kind of graffiti. They were aware of its kind of transnational hip-hop kind of culture that it was connected to. And a lot of them, as I said, had kind of flags embedded in the images too. And that was an interesting thing to find among young people who were often, researched as constrained to their local postcode. In the way that they culturally represented themselves, that wasn't the case. I think also the method itself, the way that we use combinations of narrative media is something that one sees quite a lot actually in narrative work now, and that's a kind of transferable thing to be happening. So I guess I'm using this as an example of the fact that chapter, which has a trajectory built into the title, from to, no longer really has such a firm trajectory. It's more of a kind of meander between those two, I think. That's all. Am I in time?
A pleasure. When I was asked, I have to say, to say something about the book, I thought, as a sociologist who's done a lot of qualitative research over the years, I thought, oh, this is the opportunity to get my head around these, what I thought, it seemed to me, very difficult questions, like what is narrative? What is its status as an approach? Is it theoretical? Is it a methodology? And I'm so relieved to hear Maria try to tell us that we should get outside of our comfort zones of particular disciplines and try to categorize everything, because I came to the conclusion after reading your book that these, not in the way that you have, but in a very sort of intuitive way, that narrative isn't any one thing, that you can't define it specifically, and it certainly isn't, it seems to me, a methodology. And that is very helpful, I think, to put those, to get rid of those things that can bug you. So to the presentations, Molly's presentation subtitle was The Shifting Ground of Interpretation. And I think that this is so very germane for our times, because so much work today and increasingly in the future will be carrying out secondary analysis of our own data and of other people's. And thank you for the inspiring visuals and the wonderful quotations, which I shall try to keep somewhere so I can come back to them. And I think you've done a very good job of reconceptualizing or conceptualizing what is secondary analysis, because central to it is this process of interpretation. And I thought your design, or maybe you didn't design it like this at the beginning, but your research design of coming back to a set of people whom you'd interviewed at a really important moment in history, and then coming back to them 15 years later and giving their material back, and then interviewing them again, was a remarkable kind of test, in a sense, of a secondary analysis, as well as a really exciting thing to do. And I think your emphasis really is on time being critical to the creation and life of a data set, and I think it's something that we don't often give enough importance to in looking at the moment in time in which data are collected, when they're analysed, and certainly when they're reanalysed in a very different historical period, but also at a moment, as you say, we are always in the moment of analysis. It's not something that you can stay in. And I was thinking about, well, what about my field notes that I collected, which I thought were in the moment of analysis? But of course, I come to them inevitably at a later moment in the analysis. And in a sense, going back to Les Back's eloquent comment, there's a kind of tendency when we write, do our preliminary analysis, call it field notes if you like, to kind of freeze that, to think it is frozen, and that we somehow have to come to terms with that when we're writing about it. And of course, our ideas move on, we relate to other people's ideas, and so on and so on. So, as you say, there's a lack of stability in interpretation at lots of different levels. And in your work, I thought the macro level, was so wonderfully written into it, so that, and so importantly, from the point of view of being a very important historical piece of research. So the listener, the analyst are unstable, and the story, as you say, is never complete, and the world out there is also unstable. And to turn now to Gerrit, his presentation, and I learnt a lot from, having never read Deleuze, from the rhizomatic approach. And I thought this too was very refreshing of our conceptual thinking. This notion of narrative as a polyphony of voices, and as you say, it's almost physiological, as well as kind of through the text, so that the subjectivity of the narrator is understood not as coherent or unified or essentialized, but is embedded and connected to the sociocultural context. And I think when I have all the way through doing qualitative analysis, I thought the most interesting aspects of it were the contradictions within what people say. And I suppose I've kind of come at it looking at how are data created in terms of the interaction in the interview as well. But that also that the people themselves are not actually, don't have one single story to tell, because stories are never complete. There are lots of little ends that we pick up and drop and sometimes don't want to finish. So narrative is about performance, and I suppose thinking in a totally different sphere, I think perhaps my understanding of narrative is through plays and the different ways in which you have the playwright who writes a text, perhaps hundreds of years ago, you have the director, you have the actors, you have the critics, you have the audiences, and then you have time and place. So a play can be cause a riot in one particular city at a particular moment in time. And another place, another time, people might kind of walk out and say, this is complete rubbish, and it turns out to be a great piece of literature. So timing, performance, and so on are very important. And I found very helpful the, if I may call it, probably not the right word, a technique for looking at the use of pronouns and passive and active use of verbs in the voice, in the polyphony of voices and the audiences to which they speak. And I thought that was a very useful way, a kind of buffering against our own researcher bias, because as Maria said earlier, we're always trying to define things. I mean, academia is all about that. And it's sort of about staying in comfort zones or creating comfort zones in which we can build our reputations or whatever. And I think looking at this with this rhizomatic approach takes us outside our frames of reference, that if we try to overimpose them on our data or, bring theories to it because they suit our own purposes. And it's a very compelling metaphor, rhizomes, I think. And to Corinne's chapter, which, when I read it, I thought was a really valuable exegesis of the different approaches to narrative. And I was pleased to hear that she felt she was speaking in a number of voices in a way. And it's a very important linking chapter, I think, between other chapters and other takes on narrative. And the different, where am I in my notes? Sorry, I've put them in a different order. So, she begins with the features of first-person storytelling and distinguishes narrative experience from event-focused narrative. And I won't go into what she covers in that. And the different modalities in which narratives are produced are the visual, the spoken, the written, and so forth. And this was when, at that point in the book, when I began to be opened up felt I was being opened up to the various possibilities that lay ahead. And I particularly enjoyed the part of the chapter in which Corinne sets out some of the critiques of the experience-centered approach. What I thought she was saying was that there's a tendency sometimes to typologize narratives too tightly, and a tendency, again reflecting what has already been said, to assume that narratives have a coherence, whereas we should be starting from the point that narratives are not necessarily coherent, and that is that contradiction is intrinsic to storytelling. She gives her own work on the narratives of South African interviewees who are HIV positive. And this is also present in the narrative of Ellen in Gerrit Lutz's chapter. And the importance of being open, I think she also emphasized, to narratives about sensory and bodily experience, which is in Lars Christer Heden's chapter, which is one of the three, I think, that I've yet to read, and I really look forward to finishing the book.